I think this is a topic that a lot of people hopefully will resonate with because when I think of women's health and when a lot of us think of women's health, we tend to think about menopause. We don't really tend to think much about the menstrual cycle, which is interesting because, as women, we'll go through it for at least 30 years or so. So it is a really, really important part of women's health and something that I think needs to be discussed more to help us understand the different parts of the cycle and how they impact us. But before we get started, just to introduce myself, so my name's Jemma. I am a registered nutritionist and a health coach. I've got a massive passion for women's health education and just really helping people to make changes that align with them. And I'm joined tonight by my wonderful colleague, Eimear. Eimear, do you want to introduce yourself?
Yeah, absolutely. So, hi everyone. My name is Eimear, and I am a registered dietitian and also a health coach here at Second Nature. And similarly to Gemma, I have a real passion for women's health, and for supporting people to develop healthy, sustainable habits. So, yeah, really excited to be doing this webinar this evening.
Love that. Right, so we will be covering a few different things tonight. Just change that. So we will be covering a few different topics tonight, and we'll get started with talking about what the menstrual cycle is. Then we will lead into the role that our hormones play during the cycle. Then we'll lead into Eva's part, where she'll be talking about menstrual cravings, as well as some top tips to optimize your habits, including how to manage cravings, because I know that that is a huge one. As a health coach, it comes up all the time when I'm talking to members. So hopefully you'll find that really, really helpful. And then at the end, we will lead into a Q&A. So what I would just ask, if you don't mind, if you do have any specific questions throughout, please pop them in the Q&A chat rather than the Zoom box, like the Zoom chat, because it's just so easy to lose questions and we want to make sure that as many of them get answered as possible. And if anyone is hard of hearing, there is a setting at the bottom of the page where you'll be able to have a live transcript if you just press show captions. So before we dive deep into the menstrual cycle and what it is, I just wanted to share a little bit about Second Nature, who we are and what we do. So Second Nature, we are a behavior change program. We really encourage people to make behavior changes to their diet, to their exercise, sleep, stress, mindset, all the really important pillars of health in a way that works for them, but also in a sustainable manner because we don't believe in fad diets, we don't believe in restriction or calorie counting because it just isn't sustainable for the long term. And I know a few of you on the call will be members with Second Nature, which is fantastic. So you'll know how the program works. But if anyone watching right now is not a part of Second Nature, you've not maybe heard of us before, do check out our website. It's www.secondnature.io, and you can find out more there. So I wanted to start off with a true or false because I want to gauge your understanding of certain parts of the menstrual cycle. So Ema is kindly going to help me out with a poll. So the first question is there are four phases in the menstrual cycle. So true or false, if you just press one of those and then we'll share the results.
So, we're getting a lot of truths in at the minute.
Great. Oh, actually, I
Uh,
shouldn't say that, should I?
Let me see. Okay, we'll give it another second. Okay, so majority is saying 88% is saying true and 12% is saying false.
That is correct. There are four phases in the menstrual cycle, and I will be delving deeper into that shortly. And
Amazing.
then second one is everyone's cycle is 28 days long.
Okay, getting quite a lot of falses. Yeah, majority 96% have said false.
Wow. Yeah, so that is false. Well, it's true, but it's false. So not everyone's cycle is 28 days long. I think that it can be difficult because some people's cycle can be less, it can be more. And I think that's the one thing that I really want to caveat throughout this is that while there is, a baseline measure for how long our cycle is, how long our period is, everyone is going to be different and there's going to be a lot of things affecting this. Third, we burn more calories in our luteal phase. True or false?
Okay, it's very much 50-50 here.
Oh, interesting. So this was something that I found so interesting when I first started researching the menstrual cycle a couple of years ago, because I wasn't aware of this. You know, when we get cravings and we actually genuinely feel that hunger during a certain part of our cycle, which, so the luteal phase is our latter part of our cycle, our energy requirements change slightly. So, because we've got a breakdown of different nutrients, we can end up feeling more hungry because we're burning more energy. So, it is true, we burn more calories in our luteal phase. And then, last but not least, our cycle can increase food cravings.
Okay, 100% is saying true.
Fantastic. Yeah, very true. I don't know one woman that doesn't get cravings through their menstrual cycle. If you do, then let me know because I have not met anyone yet. Fab. Okay, so what is the menstrual cycle? So essentially, the menstrual cycle exists as a way of reproducing, and this helps us to get pregnant, have children, etc. And this cycle begins around the age of 12 and it prepares our body for a potential pregnancy. So during a certain phase of the cycle called the ovulation phase, our ovaries will release an egg. If this egg does not get fertilized, the body will break down the lining. This is expelled as blood, and this is what we tend to know as our period. Now, this will continuously happen through four different phases, and this will help to keep the cycle going. And this cycle will continue until we reach menopause. So, what will happen is when we get into, say, late 30s, early 40s. I think perimenopause varies again because some people can start getting the symptoms early on. Some people can get them like a little later in their 40s, but you may start to notice that you get less periods. Things just become a little bit more infrequent, and then you start noticing symptoms along the way. But that is a general overview of how it would work. And with these four different cycles, I think this is the thing that's really key. And these four different phases, you've got menstruation, aka period, follicular phase, ovulation, and our luteal phase. So menstruation is our period, and what I've done is I've popped in an example of what my Flow app. So I don't know if anyone uses a tracker to track their periods, but I find it really, really useful. I've been using the Flow app for about maybe 4 or 5 years. And I think because it's got to know my symptoms, it's got to know my cycle over time, it's quite good at predicting when I'm going to come on, and it's only usually a day or two out. Because I can find what's really difficult to understand is when we're actually trying to track our cycle, if we don't know what we're trying to track and we don't understand what's going on, it's really hard to kind of differentiate what's going on. But with this part of the cycle, this is where we'll bleed. It marks the start of a new menstrual cycle, and this typically lasts around 3 to 7 days. But as I said at the beginning, this can be less or more depending on the individual. And lots of symptoms during this time. We've got cramps, fatigue, a little bit of bloating, mood changes, and our the two hormones, estrogen and progesterone, are the hormones that play the biggest part in our menstrual cycle, and they are at their lowest during this phase. Then leading into the follicular phase, it overlaps with our period. So we've got menstruation, but then on the day one of our period, this is when the follicular phase will begin. And this typically lasts around 14 days. So this is the point where the lining of our uterus starts to thicken, our body's getting ready to release an egg. This is the stage where people start to kind of feel an improvement for the most part. They might start to feel a difference in their mood, maybe feeling a bit more energetic, feeling happier, and just generally feeling a bit better in themselves. And at this time, we've got progesterone, which is remaining low, but then estrogen levels are starting to rise, and they will peak just before ovulation. So then we've got ovulation, and I've also put in an example here because something that I didn't realize as well, when I used to think about ovulation, I thought it was just one day. And while you do have your day of ovulation, you've actually got your fertile window. So that is classed as the 5 days before you ovulate up until the day afterwards. So it's interesting to know this. And this is another reason why I quite like tracking my cycle and why I find a lot of women do find this helpful is because they can see, especially when you're trying to get pregnant, to see where your fertile window is. Now, this typically begins around the middle of our cycle. For example, this would be around day 14 of a 28-day cycle. So our luteinizing hormone will trigger ovulation, causes the ovaries to release an egg. And again, this is at this point our estrogen. So estrogen is normally seen as like the positive hormone of our cycle. And this is when people tend to feel good. I don't know if you've heard of it before, but people call it like ovulation glow because our body at this point is it's almost like ready to mate. So we're going to be at our best. We're going to like skin's going to be glowing, our hair's looking great. We're going to be more motivated to spend more time with people. We're probably going to feel a little bit more social and we'll have like that heightened focus. So, if you're like at work and you're really zoned in, there's a chance that maybe it's aligned with your cycle. And then our luteal phase, the poor luteal phase gets quite a bad rap for bringing on all of the negative parts of the cycle. But it doesn't always, I'm currently in my luteal phase, and usually when I'm in my luteal phase, I feel tired. I just don't really want to do anything. I don't want to socialize or really, just do anything that I would want to do when I'm maybe in that follicular phase, feeling a bit better. But this is what you'll find out during the webinar is that if you try to optimize your habits in a way that works for you within the pillars of health, so like with your exercise, for example, you can offset some of the negative impacts that can have. So where you might naturally feel a bit more tired, doing things like getting out for a walk can actually help you to feel better during this phase. So this is from ovulation up until the first day of our next period, so typically around 10 to 14 days. This is also the point where we're experiencing that higher breakdown. So, I was saying in the beginning that when we are in a certain stage of our cycle, so when we're in the luteal phase, that we burn more calories. This is during this phase, and it's because we have that higher breakdown of protein and fat and an increase in our BMR. So that together can then lead to us feeling more hungry. So we spoke a lot about progesterone and estrogen, but what roles do these play? So estrogen, it is our female sex hormone. It's responsible for regulating our reproductive functions and our menstrual cycle as a whole. It helps to build up the lining of the uterus. It tells the body when it's time to release an egg. And as I said, estrogen levels peak around the ovulation phase, but then once the egg is released, they gradually start to just decline, and then progesterone's on the rise. So when we think about estrogen dipping and progesterone rising, it's when progesterone starts to rise that we can start to notice those negative associations. But when estrogen is high, better mood, high motivation, increased exercise performance, and generally just feeling better in ourselves for the most part. And then progesterone. So I think progesterone and the luteal phase as a whole, whenever I start, like I listen to podcasts or I do listen to like read research or watch videos about the menstrual cycle, people do tend to talk about them or I read about them in quite a negative way. But it doesn't always be that way for everyone. I think, some people will notice the impact of higher progesterone, but some people won't notice it at all. But with progesterone, it's the hormone that regulates the menstrual cycle and prepares the uterus for pregnancy by thickening its lining. And as estrogen rises, progesterone will rise alongside it, and this peaks during our luteal phase. And as I said, it can offset some of the benefits that estrogen gives us, but not always. But progesterone does reduce food satisfaction and increase our appetite. So when this does happen, this can then lead into those cravings and why we start to crave certain foods around this stage of our cycle. And testosterone, I feel like this doesn't always get spoken about a lot. It plays quite a small role, but quite a mighty role. It helps estrogen and progesterone to do their job effectively so that the body knows when it's time to release an egg, but it also serves as a precursor for estrogen. And this will help to keep our cycle running smoothly. This can then help us to have those benefits, feeling more active, feeling happy, feeling motivated, because I think It's unlikely, right? There are parts of our cycle where we might not be feeling great, but equally, there's so many other things going on in each of our lives that it's not just going to be our menstrual cycle that's affecting how we're feeling on a day-to-day basis. And lastly, just to summarize how these hormones work in action. So, as you can see, between week 2 and week 3, estrogen is at its highest. Testosterone tends to kind of stay the same the whole way through. It does peak a little bit during the ovulation phase, but for the most part, it's estrogen that has the biggest impact during ovulation. And then you'll see between week 3 and 4 that progesterone starts to rise. So, I think it's quite nice sometimes just to see how it works on a week to week basis, and also just understanding when we're at a certain part of our cycle, how these are going to impact us. And speaking of how it might impact us, PMS is something I'm sure lots of you are aware of. So, premenstrual syndrome. Now, a lot of women struggle with PMS. Around 90% of women have some form of symptom. There are over 150 different symptoms, which is crazy when you think about it, but a lot of them are, standard like mood swings, irritability, fatigue, bloating, breast tenderness, headaches, those cravings again, difficulty concentrating, and these usually occur a couple of weeks before your period. Although, from working with different members and working with clients and women in general, some people do experience PMS during different times of their cycle. Again, I think it goes back to what is going to work for one might not work for another, and our cycle isn't always going to be as we expect or as it's written in research, etc. Now, PMDD is something that isn't really spoken about enough, and I think PMDD, there's still a lot of emerging research in it. So, premenstrual dysphoric disorder, it is essentially a lot worse than PMS symptoms, to the point where people can have suicidal thoughts. And the symptoms of PMDD are far more severe than PMS. But sometimes, because the symptoms can overlap, people might think that they are, suffering with really bad depression, really bad anxiety. But sometimes they're not maybe finding the link that this might only be happening, say, for a week or two each month, where there's a link to their cycle rather than it happening every day. And there was a like really, really interesting review that I read from 2022, and it looked at 44 global studies, over 50,000 participants, with women and girls who are experiencing symptoms of PMDD. But the interesting thing is, and just shows how much still needs to be done with this, and people still need to find out more about this, is that there needs to be stricter diagnostic methods, because from what it looks like is, you might go to a GP where they don't really know about it or they haven't heard about it before, and people might have different criteria for getting diagnosed with it. So I think this is something that is, emerging. I'm hoping that in the next few years, and with having webinars like this and people talking about it more, that people will become more aware of this. But the reason I wanted to share this is because it's important to know, if you struggle with really bad PMS during certain parts of your cycle, that's important, and you need to know that you're not alone in experiencing those symptoms. But if you do, please, please reach out to your GP, or another medical professional to get some support with that. And I couldn't not say anything about hormone balancing, because I see it all over social media all the time, people trying to sell products or people putting out lots of information about hormone balancing. And I just wanted to say it is so normal for our hormones to rise and fall. We cannot change a lot of what happens with our hormones. As I just said, with everything going on in our menstrual cycle, with progesterone rising and decreasing, and the same with estrogen, that is going to happen regardless of what we do with our habits. And while we can't change that rise and fall throughout the month, what we can do is try to optimize our habits in a way that can support us. So making those small tweaks to our diet, making small tweaks to our exercise, getting some earlier nights when we know that maybe we're in our luteal phase and we're not feeling great. Those kind of things can support our hormones, but we can't necessarily balance them in the way that we want to. So I just thought it was really important to mention that, because, yeah, there's a lot of noise out there, and I think it's important not to get too caught up with it. And also just don't believe everything that you see. Always do your own research. Make sure that you're checking the facts. And if you do feel, like I said, in about PMS and PMDD, if that is something you're struggling with, or maybe you want to talk to someone in more detail, reach out to your GP, a registered dietitian, or a gynecologist about this. So, summary. So, the menstrual cycle will begin around the age of 12 and it will continue until we reach menopause. And there are four main phases in the menstrual cycle. So, we've got menstruation, follicular phase, ovulation, and luteal phase. Our hormones will naturally fluctuate throughout the month, and this is completely normal. But if you do notice any changes that don't feel normal for you, please reach out to your medical provider. And again, each woman's cycle lengths will vary, same with periods. It isn't always a cause for concern. However, if you start to notice things are changing, doesn't feel quite right for you, or maybe after this you think, oh, do you know what, my cycles have been a bit different over the last like year or so, it's definitely worth speaking to someone about that. And now I will lead you into the lovely Eimear talking about cravings during the menstrual cycle.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Jem. That was really useful to get a deep dive into the different phases and how much our hormones really do fluctuate. So, what I'm going to focus on now is I'm going to talk a little bit about cravings during our menstrual cycle. So, we're going to talk about what they are. We're going to talk about some factors that influence them. And then we're also going to talk about what strategies we might use to help manage them. So, first off, what are menstrual cycle cravings? So, we know that they are food cravings that most commonly occur in the luteal phase of our cycle. So, that's mainly in the 7 to 10 days leading up to our period. And as Jem has already alluded to, we know that of the 90% of women who do experience premenstrual symptoms, that at least 70% report to experience food cravings. So, we know that they are extremely common. And I think reminding ourselves of that is really important when it comes to managing them. So, I have a bit of a question that I wanted to get everyone's input on. So, it would be great if you could share your answers into the chat. So, my question to you is, what do you think is the most common premenstrual food craving? And I'm going to caveat this and say amongst women in the UK specifically. So, the options are chocolate, fruit, bread, or cereal. So, I'll give everyone a minute to input what answer they think is correct. Nice. I'm seeing some chocolates.
I've got
Great.
lots of chocolates.
Yeah, I'm seeing lots of chocolates. Yeah. Amazing, absolutely. So that is the correct answer. So we know that women in the UK most commonly report to experience cravings for chocolate. And the reasons for that include things like changes to our hormones, that we'll talk a little bit more about in a couple of slides. But also, really interestingly, on that point of cravings, there has been some research done that's looked into how women's cravings differ depending on what country they live in and what culture they're from. And really interestingly, in the UK and the US, women most commonly report to experience cravings for chocolate, but in other countries that's significantly lower. So they found that women from Egypt, for example, only 6% reported to experience cravings for chocolates. So they had much more of a preference for savory food. So I think it really just demonstrates the impact that our environment and our culture has on influencing our food choices, but then also influencing the types of foods that we crave as well. So here what we have is, if we just go back a slide first, if that's okay, Jem, thank you. So what we're going to do here is just talk about some other cravings that we might experience. So we said chocolate's a common one, but we know that there's other things too. And this isn't a prescriptive list here. There might be other things that you notice you crave for, and that's completely normal. So we've got our refined carbohydrates, so things like our white bread, white rice, white pasta, and then as we said, our sweets, our chocolate, and our pastries as well. And we know that we have a specific preference for craving these types of carbohydrates because we know that they help to release serotonin in our body. And serotonin is a chemical that is often called the feel-good chemical. So when we have normal to kind of higher levels of serotonin, we typically tend to feel better. Our mood tends to be higher. And when we have kind of lower levels, that's often associated with lower mood. And so our bodies know that when we ingest some of these refined carbohydrates that we get that boost of serotonin, which is particularly important in the luteal phase because we know that actually our serotonin levels are naturally lower at this point in our cycle. We've also got our hyperpalatable foods. So these are foods that are rich in refined oils, refined carbohydrates, and sugar. So most commonly, that might be something like a takeaway. So some of them really comforting meals. Finally, then we've got our ultra processed foods as well. So these are our foods that are higher in salt. So examples might be things like crisps, chips, roast potatoes, and also ready and processed meals as well. So some of them overlap with the hyperpalatable foods too. These are some of the most common we might experience. Amazing. So now what we'll do is we'll look at some of the factors or the triggers that might be influencing our cravings. So first up, we've got our hormonal changes, which I know Jem has already touched on quite a lot in the first half of the webinar. But ultimately, we know that in our luteal phase, our estrogen and progesterone levels are fluctuating. We tend to see that our serotonin levels are lower, as I mentioned, and we also tend to see that our cortisol levels tend to be higher. An increase in cortisol levels can kind of put our body in a bit of a fight or flight response, and this naturally requires energy, and so it can stimulate some of those cravings. We also know that we have increased calorie requirements in the luteal phase. So Jem has mentioned this as well, but it's estimated that we have up to 300 calories more or higher requirement in this last phase of our cycle. And that's mainly due to increases in our basal metabolic rate. So that's the amount of energy that our body needs to work at rest, and also increases in our body temperature as well. Next up, we've got changes to our mood and mindset, which we will talk a little bit more about in towards the end of the presentation. But another key one we have here is our changes to insulin and glucose levels. So we know that our blood sugar levels naturally do change across the menstrual cycle. And when I say blood sugar levels, I'm referring to the sugar molecules that we find in our bloodstream. And what we know is that these do naturally fluctuate. So day to day, hour to hour, when we eat a meal, we often see these increase and then they can drop if we haven't eaten for a period of time. However, this is specifically related to our menstrual cycle. So if we look at this diagram, we can see that the purple dotted line demonstrates the average blood glucose levels. And we can see that it's at its lowest in the late follicular phase. It starts to kind of rise up from ovulation, and we see it peak in the luteal phase with a kind of sudden drop afterwards during menstruation. And what this increase in or peak in the luteal phase basically means is that there's lots of these sugar or energy molecules in our bloodstream, but actually they're not being moved across to our cells to be used as energy. And the reason for this is because insulin, which is the chemical that usually will attach to these sugar molecules and bring them to our cells, isn't necessarily working as efficiently at this stage. And so what we see is we see this increase in blood sugar levels, we see these increase in insulin levels, but it's not being used efficiently by our cells. So what does this mean for cravings? Basically, what this means is that our cells are thinking, we're not getting enough energy, we need more. So we're going to stimulate some of those cravings to ensure that it's getting the energy ultimately that it needs. Amazing. If we can go to the next slide, Jem. Brilliant. So we have talked about then what cravings are. We've talked about the factors that influence them. So now let's take a look at how we might go about managing them. So we're going to focus on two main strategies here. We're going to focus on looking at finding balanced alternatives to the foods that we're craving. And then we're also going to look at using some mindful eating strategies as well. So if we start off by looking at making some balanced swaps. So what we can see from the types of foods that we typically tend to crave is we know that a diet high in these foods, so high in refined carbs, high in hyperpalatable foods, is associated with increased risk of developing conditions like type 2 diabetes, for example, and higher blood cholesterol levels. And so we want to be mindful of the portions and the amount ultimately that we're having of these. So that's not to say that we need to completely cut them out of our diet and we can never have them. It's just about, including them in our diet in moderation. So, simple thing that we can do is we can try and find some food alternatives that will still satisfy our cravings, but maybe will offer that bit of extra nutrition. So, in the case of refined carbohydrates, could we actually opt for a complex form of carbohydrate instead? And this is a type of carbohydrate that is higher in fiber. So, examples would be our whole grain products like our breads, our rices, our pasta, even things like our beans and legumes. The higher fiber content that these contain mean that they get digested quite a lot slower by our body. And so there's a slower release of energy. We also know that they have a really good micronutrient profile. So they contain things like B vitamins, for example, which are really beneficial. In terms of hyperpalatable foods, then, if we were to focus mainly here, let's say on takeaways, you're really craving a takeaway. Could it be that you think about making or replicating a fake away at home? So, recreating that meal, but potentially having a bit more control over what actually goes into it and the balance that it has. So, we do actually have some really delicious recipes in our cookbook and on our app that can be used as fakeaways. So, one of my favorites is actually the lamb massaman curry. So, if you've not tried that, I would definitely recommend. But we have some lovely recipes that I would recommend taking a look at. And then finally, when it comes to our sweets, our chocolate, and our other foods that are rich in added sugars, one of my favorite alternatives there is to go for something like Greek yogurt. So a couple spoonfuls of Greek yogurt, a portion of fruit, and then maybe a square or two of dark chocolate. And in that meal, what you have is you've got the protein, you've got the fat from the yogurt, but you've also got that sweetness from the fruit and from the chocolate as well. In the next slide, then, I've got a couple of more balanced snack ideas that you might want to have handy in your cupboards if you do know that, cravings are potentially going to come up. So, looking at the apple slices with the nut butter, again, that's a really good option if you have that sweeter craving. The apple gives you that bit of sweetness, whereas the peanut butter gives you that bit of fat and protein as well. The chickpeas, they're an excellent option if you have more of a savory or a salty craving. So the chickpeas are excellent sources of protein, but we can add lots of flavor. We can add herbs and spices on top to provide that extra bit of taste. Amazing. So there's some of our balanced snacks. Next up, another way that we can go about managing cravings is to think about using some mindful eating strategies. If you are on the Second Nature program, you may or may not be familiar with both of these strategies. But ultimately, we've got the whole strategy here and the urge surfing strategy. And these are basically tools or techniques that we can use to really check in with how we're feeling, to kind of take a minute to step back and identify what it is, what food we're craving, and to kind of understand it a bit more before we act on it. So if we were to talk through just the whole strategy today, we know that this is a 4-step strategy. And basically what it recommends we do is once we've identified our craving is to kind of take a minute, take a deep breath. So kind of 10 seconds just to breathe. And within that time to get your phone out and start a timer for 10 minutes. During this 10 minutes, then you want to be thinking about doing something to distract yourself. So that might be getting up and ringing a friend for a chat. It might be doing some housework that needs to get done. It might be going for a walk. So just anything to get yourself up and distracted. And during this 10 minutes as well, to kind of have a think about, where might this craving be coming from? Have I had a really stressful day? Am I feeling really tired? Am I in the luteal phase of my cycle, for example? So to try get a bit of an understanding. Then, if towards the 10 minutes is finished, you actually realize, you know what, I'm genuinely hungry here and I do want something, that's absolutely fine. Go for your balanced snack or maybe a meal even. But often what we find is that people notice that the craving has passed at this point. So by getting up, kind of distracting themselves and understanding where it's coming from, that can really help to just let it pass and slide over. So this is a really good strategy that I would recommend you try next time you experience a craving. Nice. So if we go to the last slide on cravings, this is a bit of a flow chart that I like to use myself to try and help me kind of work through things in my head. You might find this useful, you might not find this useful, and that's absolutely fine. But basically, once you've identified what your craving is, number one, ask yourself the question, could my craving be related to my menstrual cycle? If the answer is no, then think about, what other triggers might be affecting this craving. Is it an emotion? Is it habit? Or is it an actual hunger? If it is related to your menstrual cycle, then trying to identify what food it is specifically that you are craving. So to kind of put a name on it. Once you manage to do that, you want to think about, okay, is there a balanced alternative that I can think of that will satisfy this craving? So some of those options that we've just mentioned. If the answer is yes, then absolutely go ahead and opt for that. If the answer is no, then thinking about, can I bring on some of these strategies like the whole strategy, for example. So yeah, this might be something you refer back to, or these are a couple of questions that you can ask yourself next time you experience a craving. So that brings us then to the end of talking about cravings for now. What we're going to do for the last couple of minutes is talk through some other lifestyle habits that we know are often impacted by our menstrual cycle. So I've outlined these in the next slide, and they are our general dietary requirements. We're going to talk a little bit about exercise, and then we're going to finish speaking a little bit about mood. So we know that our body's nutritional needs do change across the cycle, and we've already touched on the fact that our energy requirements increase in the luteal phase. But there are also other nutrients that we need to be really aware of, with one of these being iron. So we know that women naturally have a much higher iron requirement, and this is because we lose a significant amount during our period. We know that iron deficiency is really common amongst women in the UK. So it's estimated that between 12 and 15% of women of childbearing age in the UK are iron deficient. And in terms of pregnancy, we know that 1 in 4 women during pregnancy are estimated to become anemic. So it's something that we really need to be aware of. And being conscious of the signs and symptoms is really important as well. So some of the most common symptoms you might experience would be things like hair loss, might be fatigue, it might be kind of a quicker heart rate, or even things like brittle nails as well. So these are all things that we need to kind of be aware of. In terms of our protein and our fat requirements, we also know that they are slightly higher in our luteal phase. So really interestingly, our body usually uses carbohydrates as its main or most readily available form of energy. However, what has usually happens in the luteal phase is it actually makes a bit of a switch and it starts to use fat as its main source of fuel. Because of that, we need to ensure that we are consuming enough fat in our diet. Equally, from a protein perspective, we tend to use and break down more protein during that last luteal phase as well. Okay, so how can we go about then actually meeting these requirements? So, as a general rule of thumb, we want to ensure that we're aiming for balance across our diet. So, basing our choices as much as possible on fresh foods, on minimally processed foods, instead of those ultra processed ones that we've previously talked about. In terms of meeting that extra calorie requirement, it might be that we think to add an extra portion of fat or protein to our meals. So that could be at dinner time, adding an extra dollop of butter onto our potatoes, for example, or it might be adding a couple of extra grams of chicken into our meal. Equally, it could be that we bring forward one of those balanced snacks that we talked about, and implement that in between a meal either. In terms of iron requirements, then, first and foremost, we want to be including iron-rich foods across our diet. And we know that iron is found in a wide range of foods, in both animal and plant-based foods. So we have some examples here on the slide. We know that our green leafy vegetables, things like spinach, are an excellent source, our lentils, our legumes, our beans. And then from an animal perspective, we know that red meat and liver are probably the most highly concentrated sources of iron. And when it comes to iron, we know that there's different types in plants versus animal, and these different types are absorbed quite differently. So we know that our body doesn't typically absorb the non-heme iron found in plant foods as efficiently as it does the plant-based, so the heme iron form. Because of that, if you are someone that follows a plant-based diet, so you are a vegetarian or you are vegan, it would definitely be worth investigating the potential to supplement your diet with some additional iron. This would be something that you would kind of speak to your healthcare professional about, so whether that's a registered nutrition professional or your GP, for example. In terms of our protein and fat, then, we know that these are found in widely across our diet in lots of different foods. Some, to name a few, we've got nuts, seeds, oils, dairy products. And the key thing that we want to think about here is including these evenly across our diet. So instead of having just, let's say, a very large portion of protein at dinner time, we want to make sure that we're actually spreading it across breakfast and lunch as well. Okay, so we'll touch on exercise next. It looks like our answer has come
It,
up ahead of time.
I'm so, yeah, I was going to say the transitions just not worked there. So if
That's
everyone just
okay.
not wants to look at yeah, look at the true or false, don't look at the answer yet.
Yeah, no, that's absolutely fine. The true or false was going to be, is it true or false that it's not safe to exercise while on your period? So we know the answer here, so we can just chat around it. So the answer is false. So we know that actually exercising while on our period can provide us with lots of benefits. It can improve our mood. It can help alleviate symptoms like bloating, and it can also help improve our menstrual cramps and make them feel a bit more manageable. And the way that it's thought to do this is that basically when we exercise, lots of blood gets boosted around our body, and we also get this release of endorphins. And again, we know that endorphins are these happy hormones. So when we have higher levels of endorphins in our body, we often tend to feel a bit more positive. When I'm referring to exercise as well here, it's really important to note that this isn't high intensity exercise we're talking about. This is more so any type of movement that you can. So something like walking, it might be stretching, just any way to move your body, you can experience these benefits. And here is a bit of a table that looks a bit overwhelming to begin with, but we're going to talk through it. If you can see at the top bar, that illustrates the different phases of the cycle. Down the left-hand side, then we've got our three main hormones that we see fluctuations in. So our testosterone, our estrogen, and our progesterone. And the little ticks in the middle illustrate how much of that hormone is present at that phase. So if we were to look at the late follicular phase, for example, we can see here that estrogen levels are high. We've got our three green ticks, and progesterone levels are a little bit lower. Then at the bottom, we have this exercise section that basically demonstrates what form of exercise or what intensity of exercise you might expect to feel able to do at these different phases. So if we were to look back at the late follicular phase again, we can see here that because our estrogen levels are higher, it's likely that our motivation is going to be higher. We're going to feel more positive. We're going to have more energy. And because of that, you're likely to want to do maybe more higher intensity forms of movement. Examples here might be doing a HIIT workout. It might be running at higher intensities than you would be used to. Or it might just be doing a dance class for 40 minutes instead of your usual 20. This is true as well for our ovulation phase. We'll typically find higher intensity forms of exercise a bit more manageable. But as we transition and move into the luteal phase, we do start to see changes. So naturally, as our estrogen and our progesterone levels start to drop, we will be more inclined maybe to choose those lower, moderate intensity forms of movement. So things that are a lot more recovery focused. That could be our yoga, it might be Pilates, it might be simply going out for a walk or going for a little swim. So anything that's a bit more restorative for our bodies. So this table is a very kind of general guide, and this isn't to say that you will definitely feel like this at each of these phases. It's really important that you get to know your own cycle and get to know how you feel at different phases, because you might find in the luteal phase that actually you can do higher intensity forms of exercise and that feels okay for you. And if that's the case, then absolutely that's perfect. So it's maybe using and being aware of this information, but then also just tailoring it more so to you and your own individual cycle as well. So, some top tips then around exercise. Number one, do what you enjoy and what makes you feel good. So, we know that the more that we enjoy exercise, the more likely we are going to want to continue doing it and to form that into a habit that feels sustainable in the long run. Number two, we want to accept that we will feel differently at different phases of our cycle, and that's absolutely fine. It can feel frustrating if, for example, one week you've managed to go to the gym and do a specific session, and then the next week you go and you can't even manage half of it. That can feel frustrating. But actually understanding why this is happening and why you're feeling like this can be really empowering, and it can help us just make those small adaptations to still get the benefits that we would from exercising, but just in a slightly different way. Number three, then, if you are starting a new form of exercise, particularly during the luteal phase, you want to try keep it simple and as low intensity as you can. Think starting as small as possible and then building that up as the weeks and months go on. Okay, so finally, we're going to touch on mood. And again, we know that mood is something that can fluctuate quite a lot across the cycle, and it can be a bit of a tricky one to manage. So in the next slide, we have detailed here how you might again expect to feel at each of the different phases. So during menstruation and the follicular phase, it's likely you're going to feel the most energized, sociable, clear-minded, and happy. And that's mainly because our estrogen levels are a bit higher, and so are our serotonin levels. During ovulation, as our testosterone starts to rise, we still experience some of those higher moods and energy levels. And typically, yeah, women report to feel really positive at this phase. And then moving into the poor luteal phase again, this is where things start to get tricky for a lot of women. So feelings of anxiety, sadness, overwhelm, even things like irritability and difficulty concentrating are all very common. And again, for some women, you might experience all of these symptoms or feelings, and for other women, you might not experience any. So it's just completely dependent. And I wanted here to just share one or two quotes that I think accurately highlight or represent, how we might be feeling in this luteal phase. So this first quote from a woman said, "I go from being a reasonable human being to angry in absolutely no time. My mood swings were so bad this time, I almost cursed at my boss and quit my job." And we have a second quote here, which basically says, lately my PMS mood swings can really be felt. 1 second, I'm all smiley, and then the slightest thing makes me sad. So I think this is something that a lot of us can relate to. It's, 1 minute you're feeling really positive and happy, and then the smallest thing can send you down the other trajectory of maybe feeling a bit lower and sad. How can we go about managing these fluctuations in mood then? Number one is to validate and normalize these feelings. So to know that you are absolutely not alone in feeling like this. The majority of women do. And it's really important that we do speak to each other and we have these open conversations around how our mood is affected and how we're truly feeling at each phase of our cycle. Number two, then we can consider tracking our mood. Again, to get a bit more of an idea of our own personal cycles. So that might be doing some journaling, that might be just jotting stuff down on your phone and your notes, for example. So just getting really familiar with how we feel and how that changes. Number three, then, is to prioritize regular movement and other stress management techniques. So, for example, if we know that our luteal phase is coming up and we know that we typically feel a bit anxious at that time, can we pre-plan some stress busting activities that we know are going to make us feel good? So, could we do some yoga, meditation? Could we organize to see a friend, go for dinner, and just have that more kind of social interaction as well? Amazing. So that has brought us to the end of our webinar today. I hope that you have kind of learned from the webinar that the menstrual cycle and menstruation is a very complex biological process that happens within our body. And there's so many changes that do happen that are out of our control. And that can feel really frustrating. And it's okay for it to feel frustrating because when we think about it, some of these symptoms that we have to experience month after month are a little bit rubbish, hormonal changes, mood changes, cramps, cravings. But what we can do is we can focus on some of the controllables. So there are little steps that we can take that we've talked about today in the webinar that will help make those habits feel a bit better, that will support us to feel that the best that we can ultimately at each phase of our cycle. So yeah, I hope that you have enjoyed this evening's webinar. Thank you so much for joining and listening. I'm going to pass over to Jem now, and we're going to do a couple of minutes of a Q&A.
Hello, thank you so much, Emma. That was brilliant. I feel like with this, when you listen to a topic that relates directly to you, you take all of the feedback on board and you take all of the points because you're like, oh, actually, that might make a difference to how I'm feeling and my day-to-day life. So, yeah, I really hope that everyone listening found this useful. We do have a couple of questions in the Q&A. So we've got one. Hi, if you experience PMS type symptoms such as cramps, bloating, tiredness, moodiness, oh, I feel all of these during
Yeah.
during ovulation, is it normal? If you have any suggestions on what might be leading to this, is it a hormonal thing, diet, and how to deal with it? Okay, so I think there's a lot to unpack there. From what I gather, you're saying that you're experiencing this around ovulation. I think with PMS, it goes back to what I was saying at the beginning of the webinar, right? That it's almost like set that you might feel like this, you might feel like that. But I know people that experience those symptoms at different stages of their cycle. And also it depends on what's going on in your life. You might have things that are making you feel bloated. You might have eaten differently, you might have had more late nights, you might have more going on in your life that's contributing towards tiredness and your mood. So I guess my initial response to that would be maybe write down if there's been any like small or significant changes that are contributing. And if this is happening if it's happening during the ovulation phase every single month, maybe that's then something to talk to your GP about. Anything that you would add on top of that, Emma?
No, I think that's absolutely right. Because I think, as we've said, we are all so different. And it's just really about getting to know your own cycle and getting to know those symptoms and when you're experiencing them. And then once you have that bit more of, I guess, personalized information, you can then go and seek that one-to-one support, maybe from your GP or from another medical professional. So, yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, agreed. I really hope that helps a little bit. And then we've had another question. Will we still keep having cravings during menopause? What can we expect SN diet-wise? So perimenopause and menopause, it's not something that we're covering heavily in this webinar because I think that is a whole topic in itself. And we do have a webinar on menopause, but we're also hoping to do a newer one this year. I think women going through menopause, I work with a lot of members on the Second Nature program, and some of them do get cravings. They do experience similar symptoms to those when you're going through the menstrual cycle. Again, I would take on board the tips that you've given today, Emma, for managing those cravings. I think sometimes our hormones can work against us, right? Because it's like, for example, when I'm in my luteal phase, like I am now, my brain is just dead. Like I can do whatever I want. I've got the brain fog, and the brain fog will be there, and I just have to accept that now. And when it comes to cravings, oh my God, like there are days where I can go, right, okay, I'm gonna just try and eat a bit of dark chocolate. I'm gonna do in the back of my head, it's like I want a biscuit. Like I just want to have a biscuit. So I'm gonna have the biscuit. I'm not gonna restrict myself. But you can then use the mindful eating techniques. So if you want the chocolate, if you want to give into the cravings that you fancy, do not restrict yourself, because if you start eating everything around what you actually want, you may end up eating more than you set out to in the first place. Would you add anything else to that, Uma?
No, I 100%, I definitely agree. And I think cravings around menopause are very common as well. So our hormones are fluctuating slightly differently to what we experience during our typical menstrual cycle. But because of that, again, these similar cravings will keep coming up, particularly in perimenopause as well. So the tips that we talked about today, I think can be really relevant. And equally, as well as Jem has just mentioned, it's really important as well to sometimes honor those cravings. It's not about
Mm,
ignoring them. It's not about saying, I'm not allowed to have this or I shouldn't have this. sometimes we do just want to have a biscuit, for example, and that's absolutely fine. So it's just honoring them in moderation and then also maybe look into things like our mindful eating strategies, like we talked about today.
It's so true. And I think because we've also got that dip in serotonin during our luteal phase, we crave those feel-good foods. So actually, sometimes a little bit of chocolate or something like that might actually, on a psychological level, make us feel better. So yeah, I really do believe in honoring our cravings and using those mindful eating techniques. If you do want to have biscuit, you do want to have chocolate, it's like slowing down, mindful eating. We talk about mindful eating so much on the program because it actually does work. But
Yeah.
it is just like taking note of your senses, how does the food feel in your hand? What does it smell like? When you bite into it, can you hear the crunch? All of those little things really, really help you to focus on what you're eating because a lot of the times we can, especially during the luteal phase where you don't really want to socialize, you want to watch Netflix and you want to chill, big blanket. You might bring some food with you, to the sofa, have a film on or have a series on, and just be eating aimlessly without even paying attention. So I think slow down, pay attention, and also just normalize it. It happens to everyone. We all go through this. Doesn't matter whether we're registered nutritionists, dietitians, or anything. Like we're still human, we're still women at the end of it. So yeah, I hope that helps a little bit. And then we've had another question. Do you have any advice about middle month pain? So I'm assuming that this is like menstrual cramps. Do you have any guidance there?
I think again, when it comes to cramps, different things will work. Typically, I think some women might find not necessarily from a food perspective, but other mechanisms like things like, I don't know, hot water bottles, for example, or I've seen someone in the chat talk about how they find hot drinks useful for managing
Mm,
that can actually help to kind of soothe your system a little bit more. So whether that's like maybe a decaf tea or a herbal tea or something like that, some women find that kind of heat can help. Equally, from an exercise perspective, we know that getting that little bit of movement in, again, it doesn't have to be anything significant. It could be stretching, it could be 5 minutes of yoga or a bit of
mm.
walking that can really, as we said, help to produce those endorphins. And actually, endorphins are said to be a bit of a kind of natural pain reliever almost. So the higher levels we have of that, they kind of help to alleviate some of that like intensity maybe of those cramps. So those are the main things I would say. Do you have anything to add to that,
No,
Jen?
I would agree with that. And yeah, they say like endorphins are like nature's medicine. So yeah, I
Yeah.
agree. I do find that when I get cramps, sometimes like I'll breathe through it, do a bit of stretching on my yoga mat, actually getting outside for a walk and
Mhm.
almost doing a bit of deep breathing while I'm walking can help. I just feel like it does something to your body. It just eases things up a bit because I do think, depending on the severity of your cramps, I don't think you can always use exercise to do it and you need to listen to your body. I think sometimes if we sit in the same position for too long, the they don't really go away. Hot water bottle again can be really, really useful. I'm also the same with hot drink. Oh my gosh, like especially when it's been cold weather as well. I feel like it does the world of good. But yeah, no, great tips there. Have we got any other questions? So we've only got one other question, but it's about Manjaro. We can't really give any guidance about the weight loss medications and the symptoms regarding that. So what I would recommend doing is whether you're on Manjaro through Second Nature or outside, I would recommend speaking to your healthcare provider about that. Okay, and yeah, I don't think we've got any. I'm just gonna have one last look in the chat to see if anyone's popped any questions in there.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for all your kind comments, by the way. Just looking through them now, it's
Nice
really,
to
really
see
nice.
them. Yeah.
Yeah. And also, it's like if we've helped anyone today to just reframe the way they think around the menstrual cycle, maybe you've learned something new, maybe you already knew this. It's good to refresh your knowledge and just know that you are not alone and that so many people go through this. But no, we've got no other questions. So I will wrap up and say, Eimear, huge thank you. Your side of the presentation was wonderful. And thank you everyone for joining. Hope you found it useful and enjoy your evening. We'll be back soon.
Thank you so much,
Okay,
everyone.
bye everyone.
Bye.
Bye.